And the Cabinet Office Minister David Lidington has been defending Theresa May's handling of these latest set of talks in Brussels and said actually they were a welcome first step.
The Prime Minister is going to continue to seek the assurances that Parliament has, members of Parliament of many parties have been asking for. That work's going to continue over the days to come, and then she will bring the deal back and we'll continue that debate and have the vote.
Well, so that was David Lidington. Let's talk to our reality check correspondent Chris Morris, who's here with me at the EU summit. And Chris, extraordinary words really from Jean-Claude Juncker, saying he wants more clarity from the British side. 2.5 years after the referendum, it seems bizarre really that they're looking for more clarity. But what exactly were the EU 27 saying last night?
Well, I think the headline from it is, and we knew this already, but just reaffirmed on paper in an official statement, no renegotiation of the legally binding withdrawal agreement, which of course includes the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, the whole backstop issue. But there was also language which reaffirmed that this is supposed to be a temporary arrangement, a temporary insurance policy. But again, if you read the withdrawal agreement, that language is there already. So we're not going to renegotiate. We do want it to be temporary. And we'll do what we can to try and reassure you of that. But as you say, some of the language in a draft from earlier was taken out, and it felt like the EU was saying we are prepared to offer you a certain amount, but the idea of a legal guarantee that would go against something that's written in the withdrawal agreement, well, I don't think that was ever going to happen. I don't think the EU has ever done that. It has in the past issued legally binding statements to clarify something, but if you put in something that was in direct contradiction to the withdrawal agreement, then you're contradicting what's supposed to be a legally binding treaty. So I think that was always a non-starter.
Yeah, to be fair to Theresa May, she had fairly low expectations. She said on arriving here she didn't expect an immediate breakthrough. But is there some frustration, do you sense, among the EU 27 about the British position at the moment?
I think there is. I mean, I think the frustration is perhaps not necessarily aimed directly at her, but at the political situation as a whole. I mean, you mentioned, and it was revealing, Jean-Claude Juncker's remarks in the press conference, it's not clear what the UK wants. We saw this morning on the television feed we get of when the leaders go into their meeting room of what looked like a pretty heated discussion between Mrs May and Mr Juncker for quite a few seconds, you know, talking directly, heads close to each other, which they may have been discussing, I think, some of the remarks he made. But interesting, when a couple of the Prime Ministers came in this morning, they were saying, look, the lack of clarity is not so much with the Prime Minister, but it's with the entire situation in Westminster itself. On the other hand, some of the things that I think that she discussed in her meeting with them last night, there were reactions of bemusement. For example, she suggested that perhaps the political declaration on future relations, the non-binding element of this deal, could be put into the withdrawal agreement and made legally binding. But the point about that political declaration is it is so vague and aspirational, it really could go in any way. It could take you towards a fairly sort of hard Canada free trade agreement, or a much softer Brexit, a closer relationship with the EU, more like the relationship Norway has. So to put something with such vague language into a legally binding treaty, I think again did raise some eyebrows of surprise.
So what happens next? It's a question I've asked you many times before, but I suppose all we know for certain is that Downing Street have said there won't be a Commons vote on this before, well, this year. It'll be January, in fact. So there's a few weeks lull, in a sense. You know, what is going to happen?
I suspect it won't be a lull. It might seem like it in public, but behind the scenes I think conversations will continue. Yes, the government said it intends to have a vote in the House of Commons as soon as possible in January, certainly before the deadline of January the 21st, when it believed it would then have an obligation to tell Parliament what it was going to do next. I think there are some in the EU who are willing to have further conversations about what clarification they can give to the Prime Minister. There was a suggestion that there could even be a special Brexit summit next month, yet another one, to try and give that additional reassurance, but I don't think there's an entire unanimity of opinion about that. So the other thing which is happening, and which we're going to see accelerate next week, is no deal preparations. The EU said last night that on the 19th of December, a few days before Christmas next week, they're going to set out in even more detail the preparations they are making for the eventuality of the UK leaving the EU in March next year with no deal at all.
Chris, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Chris Morris there from our reality check team with the latest. Right, we're going to cross now to central London because a former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, is speaking about the whole question of Brexit. This is an event organised to promote another referendum, a so-called people's vote. Let's listen in to what Tony Blair's got to say right now.
Dilemma. A frictionless border between North and South in Ireland is only possible if the two are part of the same trading system, i.e. the single market and customs union. Such a border and the claim around it was not a concession by the British government, by the way. It started as a demand. Europe said yes, Ireland naturally said yes, and rightly Europe has said it will stand by that decision, and indeed so should we. But of course it completely undermines the other negotiating objectives of the government. Now, it's not clear as we speak if the Chequers proposal is extant. But what has been revealed by the whole negotiation process is that all the Brexit options have significant drawbacks when compared with staying in the European Union. It is this pursuit of incompatible ends through inept means that has led us to the present impasse. And I do not believe this impasse is resolvable by agreement on the form of Brexit, because neither pointless nor painful is attractive. One or other part of the Conservative Party will rebel, and the Labour Party will oppose. However, let's try. Let's see if a majority consensus develops. If it doesn't, if we can't find an option that meets approval in Parliament with a majority for Brexit, then the choice is between going back to the people and no deal. But surely this much is plain, if nothing else is. Whatever is the proper interpretation of the June 2016 mandate, it cannot seriously be said to be no deal. And Parliament has rightly set its face against such an outcome. Therefore, to insist that we crash out with all the disastrous implications of no deal, rather than put the matter back to the people, would be an extraordinary dereliction of duty. And I don't see it happening for that reason. But that is why it is therefore completely perverse to spend time, Europe or the UK government, in preparation for no deal, rather than in what is a much more likely outcome, which is a new vote. Now, there are still many who argue that such a vote would be undemocratic. Others that it would be divisive without being decisive. And these are important arguments which need to be dealt with. I argued for a final say referendum back in October 2016 on the basis that such a huge decision required the right to reconsider once the negotiation proceeded to a clear deal. I think that argument was strong then, but the argument today is infinitely more compelling. We've had 30 months of negotiation. Universally, it is accepted that this negotiation has been massively more fraught than anyone ever imagined. Just go back and read the speeches of government ministers in the first flush of excitement post-referendum, and read them now. Survey the political wreckage of the past weeks. Ministers resigning, the Brexit deal derided by those who most vehemently campaigned for Brexit, unable to put the deal to a vote, the Prime Minister herself put to the vote, surviving but barely, back to Europe for words that no one seriously believes will rescue her cause, several different versions of Brexit but none able to command a parliamentary majority, chaos, the character of this process, no viable solution in sight, the clock, which should never have been set, ticking, now ticking ever louder as we approach the midnight hour. All of this, by the way, while domestically, in the last 24 hours alone, we've seen reports of 12-hour waits for beds in A&E having doubled, the highest level of knife and weapons offences since 2010, and a 120% increase in rough sleeping. How can it be said, how can it seriously be said that in these circumstances, given the riot of confusion we find ourselves in, that it is wrong to go back to the people and clarify whether, in the light of all of this, they wish to stay or leave? I simply ask, in what other decision of consequence in our lives, where there's a stipulated time between the original decision and the due date, where we've had 30 months of brutal education of reality, when our knowledge of the consequence is a world greater than it was when we took the decision, in what other circumstances would we refuse the right to reconsider? Refuse even to contemplate a change of mind, indeed regard discussion of such a change as somehow betrayal of principle? Would we take such an attitude towards the time between engagement and marriage, if that time was as hapless as ours been?
So there we are. It's just a flavour of what Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister, is saying about Brexit and the idea of another referendum on the issue. We will be trying to talk to Liam Fox, by the way, leading Brexit here a little bit later on, for his views on what Tony Blair has been saying and also on what Theresa May has been trying to achieve here at the EU summit. Well, let's discuss that a little bit more now with Jim Brunston, European Union correspondent at the Financial Times. Good to have you with us, Jim. So a pretty frosty reception all in all from the EU leaders for Theresa May, a bit of a brush off, accusing her of a lack of clarity, of being imprecise, vague. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think basically they're trying to send a couple of messages, really. One is that there's this confusion, and I think that's because what Theresa May is asking for is essentially contradictory. She's saying, I will respect the agreement we reached together and I'll try and sell that at home. But the kinds of changes she's asking for now, they really are material changes to what was agreed, and that's a problem. And the second is, I think, just that this isn't how these situations are supposed to work. Brexit itself is unprecedented, of course, but we've got decades of experience of EU leaders struggling to sell EU deals at home. You know, the Danes with Maastricht in the 1990s, Ireland with the Lisbon Treaty, the Netherlands with the treaty with Ukraine. So we know how these things are supposed to work. And the way it's supposed to work, which admittedly it's difficult for Theresa May, is you basically sort out your situation at home, you go to your rebels and you say, what do I need to get? You come up with something that's actually got a chance of being accepted by the rest of the EU. And then you come back with that to Brussels and says, look, and you say, look, I've got an agreement. If you give me this, I know that that's going to satisfy my rebels at home, and I know that's going to sort this situation. And of course, Theresa May is in no position to offer that. So why give her concessions right now?
Is there a sense here that the EU would like her to reach out to her opponents in Parliament, people like Nicola Sturgeon or Jeremy Corbyn, to get some sort of majority of MPs at Westminster and a kind of coalition around another idea of Brexit? Is that what the EU would really like?
Perhaps. I mean, there's definitely a sense now that EU leaders are starting to speak directly to Parliament. Xavier Bettel, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, was very clear about that on his way into the summit this morning. He was saying, look, the problem is not with Theresa May, it's with the MPs. You know, we've negotiated a very good deal with them, and they have to decide, do they want to have a deal with us or not? So I think there is a sense that leaders are baffled, or at least very, very concerned about the situation with Parliament, and are basically saying to MPs now, look, you have to live up to your own responsibilities when it comes to this.
She was looking to the EU27 to really bend over backwards and help her sell this deal, and in the end they haven't done that. And could they not have done a bit more? There was a bit in the draft conclusions which said they would look at finding ways to come up with further reassurances on the backstop, and then they cut that out.
Yeah, exactly. So they took the draft conclusions that were on the table. So they prepared these conclusions before Theresa May turned up yesterday, and then having spoken with Theresa May, gutted them of anything that was remotely useful to her. So that sends a symbol in and of itself.
So that's a kick in the teeth for her,
well,
isn't it?
It is, but you can kind of understand it. I mean, the psychology of this was they were expecting a vote. They were expecting Parliament to have voted on this. They were expecting Theresa May to probably have lost that vote and to come back saying, guys, look, this is the situation I'm facing at home.
So would she have been better off in a way putting it to the vote in the House, losing that vote, and then coming here?
Well, at least it was what they were expecting, and had they done that, then there are options. And this statement, the original version that actually had the useful stuff in, that actually, you know, was something they were prepared to offer. Had she potentially gone ahead with the vote? I mean, it's difficult here because we're talking about, you know, an alternative version of events and so on. But think about it from their point of view. What's the point of them emptying their box of options now? You know, emptying the toolkit for Theresa May when she's still got to have that vote? She'll still probably use it, and then we'll be back again. You know, why use up that ammunition now? Why give that to Theresa May now?
So what happens next? Downing Street have said there's not going to be a vote, you know, on the deal this year. It's going to be in January. So is it all on hold until next month?
Well, I think so talks are going to sort of continue, behind closed doors, I imagine, over the coming weeks. The key message from leaders is there's no guarantees about when they're going to meet and talk about Brexit again. I mean, one of the very interesting things about these conclusions we were talking about that were changed is exactly as you say, they took out the paragraph saying we're willing to consider further measures to help Theresa May. Now, a diplomat spoke to me yesterday about this and said, well, the reason we did that is that seemed to indicate that we were going into a process, that we were going into a process of negotiation, that this was phase one and that now there's going to be phase two in a few weeks where we're going to do more for Theresa May. And basically they hadn't heard enough from Theresa May or the right things from Theresa May to convince them to go into a process like that. And
so what more do they want from her?
I think it's not just her. I think it's the UK in general now. I think it's the UK political scene in general now. They want to have an idea of what will it take to actually get this thing over the line. And they want that thing, that X, whatever it is, they want that to be something that is remotely legally feasible. And that's just not where we are. And that's why they're saying Theresa May is confusing. It's not because she was per se confusing. It's because what she's presenting is contradictory and just completely out of whack with reality.
All right, good to talk to you, Jim Brunston, Financial Times EU correspondent. Thank you very much indeed. Well, much more from me here in Brussels in the coming hours. But let's hand you back now to the studio in London.
Ben, thank you very much. Let's take a look at the day's other main stories now. And police in France have shot dead a man wanted for the attack on a Christmas market in Strasbourg, which killed 3 people and left several more wounded. French officials said a police patrol found Sherif Shakat wandering through the streets of the city after being on the run for several days. Our Europe reporter Gavin Lee has been to the scene of the raid on a property in Strasbourg this morning, where the chase came to an end.
Well, this is the door of 74 Rue de Lazaret in Neudorf, and you can see this is the place where the suspect of the Strasbourg Christmas market's shooting, Sherif Shakat, was killed. Now, what we know has just come out from this building is 9 o'clock. Around this area, it's a heavy industrial area, residential area too. There's a football stadium here of Strasbourg. It was 3 ordinary police officers, patrol officers, who were walking past here. They saw Sherif Shakat at the door. They thought he was acting suspiciously. Were told that he looked like he was injured because he had been injured on Tuesday night after being shot in the arm as he escaped from soldiers after killing 3 people and injuring others. Now, what then happened is the officers shouted to him. He turned, we're told, shot towards the officers. As we can see here, they shot back and he was killed. So after a 48-hour manhunt, in minutes the operation was over. We also heard this morning from the French Interior Minister, who said they don't believe, the French authorities, that he had a support network. What they're saying is that they had detained members of his family, 5 members, for questioning: his mother, his father, 2 brothers and a sister, and that he effectively was hiding out here somewhere, perhaps amongst rubble, perhaps amongst familiar places he knew in the past. So this long-time career criminal, who had many charges not related to terrorism, was on a list of those who were suspected of extremism in France and was being monitored. For the moment, there will be questions about that, but there is relief here, sheer relief that it's over, and some normality returning as well, because the Christmas markets are opening after being closed today. So I think the streets have been so quiet now, some kind of life continuing, the raid being over here.
Gavin Lee reporting. Now, wages are still worth a third less in some parts of the country than a decade ago, according to a report. The UK has suffered the worst real wage slump among leading economies, says the union organisation, the TUC. The biggest losses have been in areas including the London borough of Redbridge, Epsom and Waverley in Surrey, Selby in North Yorkshire and Anglesey in North Wales, the study indicated. And let's talk now to our economics correspondent, Darshini David, who joins us now. The TUC, Darshini, is saying this is the worst pay squeeze for centuries. What do they mean by that exactly?
Yes, it's a really grim warning, isn't it? Exactly the thing you don't want to hear as you're thinking about spending ahead of Christmas. But this comes just a few days, you remember, after we were told that prospects in the jobs market had never been better. So who's right and what exactly is going on? So we can look at some of these figures here, because that record 32.5 million people in work. Those are official figures. Pay growth 3.3%, and that's reflecting average earnings, the highest in a decade. But that's just what's happening now. And if you look back across the past decade, what the TUC is saying is that pay rises fail to keep pace on the whole with the cost of living. And that means that people are, in effect, worse off in real terms. Our living standards are lower. Worst affected, as you've been saying, the likes of London, really. People there £20,000 worse off than they would have been, the TUC claims, if pay had kept up with inflation since the financial crisis.
Because the cost of living tends to be more expensive in big cities.
In big cities, and also wages tend to be higher in the whole as well, don't they? So that's the kind of thing that happened. The average worker, they're saying, has been worse off to the tune of about £11,800. What does this all mean? Well, as I'm saying, living standards, in effect, aren't as high as they used to be. If you feel your money isn't going quite as far as it used to, you're not wrong by any means. But it's not just about our own personal finances here. It also has implications for the economy as a whole, because consumer sentiment drives spending. Consumer spending, the biggest determinant of how fast our economy can grow.
I spoke to Stephen Clark from the Resolution Foundation earlier, and he says while wages are currently growing at their fastest rate in a decade and employment is at a record high, the sobering big picture is that inflation-adjusted pay is still almost £500 a year lower than when Lehman Brothers was still around. Now, Lehman Brothers, our viewers may remember, that was the biggest corporate failure in history, the Lehman Brothers Bank, that precipitated the financial crisis.
Absolutely, back in 2008.
Is it possible to catch up then?
Is it possible to catch up? Well, companies would say the onus is on us, the workers, to make that happen, because economists say one of the key reasons why we're not seeing wages grow faster is because productivity isn't rising as fast as it should. What does that mean? It basically means we should be more efficient. If we're more efficient, produce more, firms can afford to pay us more. But there's no sort of silver bullet to make that happen overnight. Firms actually have to invest more as well. Give us the tools we need to get the job done. Also, governments have to invest more in things like transport systems and things like that. Things are improving gradually, but don't hold your breath. We're still a way off, as the Resolution Foundation says, from getting back up to those income levels. It's just us and Italy, by the way, who are still lagging behind. We've got a long way to catch up at the moment.
Interesting. Darshini, thank you very much. Darshini David, our economics correspondent. Now, the Public Spending Watchdog has found that an army recruitment drive has faced significant problems, including a website that cost 3 times its budget and was 52 months late. Outsourcing giant Capita was awarded the £495 million contract for army recruitment in 2012. But the National Audit Office reports says it has failed to hit soldier recruitment targets every year since. Capita admitted it had underestimated the complexity of the project, and the Army says it has put in place a plan to address the challenges. Half of UK homes could get faster broadband with just a single call to their provider, according to the telecoms regulator Ofcom. New figures also show that 1 in 7 households could get a faster service for the same or even less money than they pay at the moment. Ofcom is launching a new website to help consumers find better deals. A 5-week-old baby who was attacked by 2 dogs near Peterborough last month has died. Reuben McNulty was seriously injured after the incident in Yaxley in Cambridgeshire. The family's 2 Staffordshire Bull Terriers have now been destroyed. And our correspondent Jane Francis Kelly is here with more on this story. What more do we know about the circumstances of this awful attack on the baby?
Reuben was just 2 weeks old when he was attacked at his home on the 18th of November by the 2 Staffordshire Bull Terriers who were destroyed after the attack. Now, Reuben had very severe life-threatening injuries. He was taken to Peterborough City Hospital and then transferred to Addenbrooke's Hospital, where he sadly died yesterday. A 28-year-old woman and a 31-year-old man were arrested on suspicion of child neglect but have been released pending further investigations. Reuben's parents have locally, or are believed to be, Amy Litchfield and Dan McNulty. The case has been referred to the coroner and is not being treated as suspicious.
OK, Jane, thank you for that update. Jane Francis Kelly. And the time is exactly 11:30 now. Let's take a look at the weather forecast with Simon King. Hello, Simon. How are things looking for the weekend?
Well, it's looking quite complicated over the weekend, Anita. There's a lot going on with the weather over the next 24 hours. I'll have more details in about 25 minutes or so. But before we get to the weekend, really, it's quite quiet out there. We've got lots of sunshine. It's still pretty chilly, mind you, but the wind not as strong as it was yesterday. So perhaps not feeling quite as bitter, but plenty of sunshine continuing. A few showers down the eastern side of Scotland, eastern parts of England. More cloud across southwest England, West Wales and across Northern Ireland. Here there could still be a few spots of rain, temperatures getting up to about 3 to 6 degrees. Now, through tonight, the cloud will thicken up in the west with that more significant rain pushing its way in. Ahead of that, though, with some clear skies, it will turn quite cold, quite frosty once again. Temperatures below freezing, but where you've got those thicker clouds and that rain in the west, 3 or 6 degrees Celsius. But as that rain moves its way further eastward during Saturday, there's going to be some strong winds, heavy rain, snow and ice. As I said, I'll have more in about 25 minutes. Bye-bye.
Hello, good morning. This is BBC Newsroom Live with me, Anita McVeigh. The headlines now. And EU leaders tell Theresa May she needs to be clearer about what she wants for her Brexit deal and warn her there's no chance of a renegotiation. The Prime Minister, meanwhile, warns the EU that it risks an accidental no-deal Brexit if she can't convince Parliament to back the agreement. Police in France shoot dead the gunman who attacked Strasbourg's Christmas market on Tuesday. Unions warn Britain has suffered the worst pay squeeze for centuries, with real pay still a third lower than before the financial crisis. Time for sport now with the latest news. Here's Catherine Dance. Hi there.
Hi Anita, good morning. For the second time in a week, Chelsea fans face allegations of offensive behaviour. First of all, 4 fans were banned from their ground after allegedly racially abusing the Manchester City player Raheem Sterling. And a statement released by the club after last night's Europa League game says anti-Semitism and any other kind of race-related or religious hatred is abhorrent to this club and the overwhelming majority of our fans. Any individuals that are found to have shamed the club will face the strongest possible action. This is after allegations of anti-Semitic chanting during the Europa League game last night. Well, Matt McGeehan from the Press Association was at the game and he says the club has had enough of this kind of behaviour.
Chelsea have a Jewish owner, Roman Abramovich. They have been very strong on anti-Semitism and discrimination of any type, and they're fed up, basically. They're a minority of their supporters are not getting the message, so Chelsea are basically telling them that they're not wanted.
Back to last night's action. Arsenal were already through but beat Qarabag 1-0, and it was a night of extraordinary drama for Celtic as they were beaten but still managed to progress to the next round. They were already a goal down before this howler of an error from keeper Craig Gordon gave Salzburg a second. At that point it looked like they were heading out, but when news filtered through that Rosenborg had drawn the other group match, it meant that Celtic's result no longer mattered. They pulled a goal back, but the celebrations had already begun. Rangers were knocked out after losing to Rapid Vienna. Now, it's the fight that everyone's been hoping would happen, and Anthony Joshua has confirmed he does want to face Deontay Wilder next year. He'd already booked Wembley for the 13th of April. All that's missing is an opponent. Joshua holds the IBF, WBO and WBA belts, but the winner of this bout would make one of them the undisputed champion of the heavyweight division. After Wilder's draw with Tyson Fury earlier this month, there had been a lot of talk about a possible rematch, but most boxing fans want to see either fighter face Joshua, who has said he is not interested in Fury because he's not the champion. The site of the Wimbledon Tennis Championships is to almost triple in size by the middle of the next decade after the neighbouring golf club agreed to sell its land. The All England Tennis Club made a reported offer of £65 million to buy Wimbledon Park, whose members include Piers Morgan and Anton Deck. They will receive around £85,000 each, along with all the rest of the members, of course, from the sale. London and Manchester are on a short list of cities to host the ATP World Tour Finals from 2021. The end-of-season tournament for the world's top 8 male players has been held in London since 2009, but that agreement expires in 2020. Singapore, Tokyo and Turin are the other contenders. A decision on the next host city will be made by March at the very earliest. And former England spinner Ashley Giles looks set to replace Andrew Strauss as England's director of cricket. Strauss is stepping down as his wife is undergoing cancer treatment. Giles is finalising the contract details to take over. He used to be England's one-day coach, and he'll be taking over at a critical time with a home World Cup and an Ashes tour to Australia next summer. Finally, Justin Rose is on course to finish the year as world #1. He needs to finish in the top 12 at the Indonesian Masters. And at the end of the second round, Rose is 8 under par, currently tied in 5th. 3 Indonesian players lead the way. Poom Saksansin out in front on 14 under par. 9 under for the round. That is all the sport for now. I'll be back with more for you in the next hour, Anita.
See you then. Thank you very much, Catherine. Let's return now to our top story. And the European Council President Jean-Claude Juncker has accused Theresa May of not being clear about what her Brexit demands are. The Prime Minister met leaders in Brussels last night, but she's been told the deal isn't up for renegotiation. So let's go back to Brussels now, and my colleague there, Ben Brown.
Yeah, Anita, it's the morning after the night before, and the night before, well, it wasn't too good for Theresa May. She didn't really get what she was hoping for. She came here admittedly saying that her expectations of some sort of breakthrough were low, and she didn't really get anything that is going to help sell her Brexit deal in the House of Commons. Jean-Claude Juncker, the Commission President, said that the British position was imprecise and nebulous and vague. And this morning, Theresa May has been in there with Jean-Claude Juncker. You can see them there talking a short time ago. Pretty animated conversation. Some people on social media suggesting she doesn't look too best pleased about what he was saying about her position yesterday. But we don't know exactly what they were saying. Certainly, she didn't get what she wanted from the EU 27. Let's try and dissect exactly what's been going on here at this summit with David Herzenhorn, who's the chief Brussels correspondent of Politico, and joins me now. David, what is your reading? The EU didn't really seem in a mood to help Theresa May.
Well, actually, they were inclined to help her if she could have conveyed to them what it is that she needs from them, what they could do that would change the math in the House of Commons. And going into this, you know, these 27 leaders are also politicians. They know how parliaments work. They can count. They know that after 117 of her own Tories voted against her this week in this confidence vote, even though she survived it, she does not have the votes for ratification of this Brexit deal. So there was nothing they could say. And they also got a clear indication from her. She was actually quite transparent. She said she didn't want to renegotiate, but then laid out some demands that made clear that she absolutely did want to renegotiate this withdrawal agreement. She did want to change the terms, especially of the backstop provision on the border with Ireland and Northern Ireland. And so once that was clear, that she was A, trying to renegotiate, and B, that she had no new information for them about how anything they said or did would change the math in the Commons, the conclusion was, look, we'll give you a bare bones restatement. This is not a trap. We want a future relationship. We want to be close to the UK going forward. But what she now has to do is call the vote, lose that vote if necessary. They understand negotiation may be inevitable, but it's not going to happen without the UK articulating where it goes next. It's not enough to come back and say, oh, we don't want this and we don't want that and we don't want the other. Well, what do you want? That's what they're asking. What would get a yes vote from MPs?
Well, surely they know, which is what everybody knows, that the backstop is the key issue, and that is what is preventing MPs supporting her in Parliament on her deal.
Well, and that's where they turn around and they say there's nothing they can do to help her, that the UK, like Ireland, is a co-guarantor of the Belfast Agreement, of the Good Friday Agreement. The purpose of the backstop, and this they've tried to reiterate, is exactly what it says in the withdrawal agreement, that there's no trick there. The backstop exists to prevent, in the case of an emergency situation where there's no future relationship, a border from being recreated on the island of Ireland. So from the EU perspective, that's non-negotiable. They believe that's non-negotiable because it preserves peace on the island of Ireland, and they believe that should be more important to the UK even than to the EU 27. So from that end, it's up to her to persuade folks back in London that in fact this backstop provision is essential, but it's also intended to never actually come into effect, to never be used. If it's ever to come into effect, it's intended to be temporary. How many more times can you say that before folks decide they shouldn't be fixated on a part of this agreement that's never supposed to happen, but maybe on the parts of the agreement that are supposed to happen? But we're not there yet.
But in the draft conclusions, they had a paragraph that said the EU stands ready to examine whether any further assurance can be provided on the backstop. She was looking for more assurances. Then they took that out of the final conclusion. So that was a kick in the teeth for the Prime Minister.
Because in fact, she may take it as a kick in the teeth, but in fact, that draft was always informal. It was never a formal draft. It was language to help them get the discussion going. But the irony here is she was looking for reassurance from them, but to get it, she had to give reassurance to them first, and she could not reassure them that in fact if they took any further steps that she would be able to actually win the vote. I mean, what I heard from a senior official who was in the room is no one in that room believes she can win ratification of this deal no matter what they do. So she's got to get on with it, call the vote, lose, then come back and say here's what the next steps that the UK is prepared to take. Is that a national election? Is that a second referendum? Is that a renegotiation with a clear description of how you can square the circle, how to protect the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, and at the same time be able to move forward and say what happens in the event of no immediate agreement on the future relationship.
So in a word, a disappointing summit for the Prime Minister.
But not a surprise one.
OK, good conclusion. David Hosenhorn, Chief Brussels Correspondent for Politico. Thank you so much for being with us and giving us your analysis. That is it from day 2 of this EU summit here in Brussels. More from me in the next hour, but Anita, back now to you.
Ben, thank you very much, but we will stay with Brexit, and I can speak now to Conservative MP and a leading member of the pro-Brexit European Research Group, the ERG, Mark Francois, who's in Westminster for us now. Good morning to you. Thanks for your time today. The EU27 have given Theresa May some further reassurances, but nothing more, and that's what they told the UK they were going to do, no renegotiation. So what is Theresa May and the Conservative Party going to do with this, the deal as it stands?
Well, remember what we're being asked to vote on. This is it. It's the withdrawal agreement, and it's a draft international treaty. If Parliament were to approve this, and then you need an Act of Parliament to ratify it, because it's a treaty, that would be binding forever in international law. And it's as plain as a pikestaff that this will never get through the House of Commons, because the House of Commons is overwhelmingly against it. That's why they pulled the vote at the last minute, because they knew they couldn't win. And
those reassurances will make any difference to anyone, if not members of the ERG, then any other Conservative MPs?
I very much doubt it, because the only thing, because it's a treaty that we're dealing with, the only thing that would change the treaty is an amendment to the treaty itself. You can come up with so-called reassurances, but they're not binding in international law. They're you know, it's like a love letter. It doesn't have legal effect. And everyone in the House of Commons knows this. You know, MPs, know a bit about the law. It's their job. They're legislators after all. And everybody in the House of Commons knows that unless you amend and change the text of the treaty, anything else is pretty meaningless. And the Prime Minister's problem, and it's a problem for the Cabinet too, is the EU have said very plainly at this meeting they're not going to reopen the text of the treaty. So the Prime Minister, I'm afraid, is completely boxed in.
Hasn't this been a failure of negotiation and a failure of planning on the UK side, though, to see what an issue, what an intractable issue the backstop would be?
Yes. We have negotiated poorly on this right from the word go. In order to show how tough we were, we offered to give the EU £39 billion of British taxpayers' money for absolutely nothing in return. Then we got tougher. Then we agreed to go into a backstop, which once we enter it, we could never leave unless the EU allowed us to leave. It's what's often referred to in Parliament as the Hotel California backstop, because you can check out, but you can never leave.
But the Prime Minister last night was criticised for a lack of clarity, but isn't it a fact that neither Theresa May or anyone else who happened to be Prime Minister at the moment could possibly offer clarity, because she is being stymied by her own party in the sense that the party is so divided over what to do? Well,
the lack of clarity, or the lack of tough, robust negotiating objectives is really ultimately the Prime Minister's fault. She's ultimately in charge, But a lot of the actual day-to-day negotiating has been carried out by a group of extremely pro-EU civil servants, led by a man called Ollie Robbins, and they don't believe we should leave the EU. They believe the British people made a mistake in the referendum, and it's their duty to save us from ourselves. So they've come up with this agreement that leaves us half in and half out of the EU, which is absolutely appalling. It completely against the spirit of the referendum that 17.4 million British people, or UK people, voted for. And the House of Commons can see all this. You know, MPs, whatever people think of us, you know, our heads don't button up at the back. And everybody can see how badly we've negotiated. I mean, can you imagine...
Sorry to interrupt, but do you have any sympathy then, given what you've just said, with the argument that actually Brexit, the process, is in such a mess at the moment, it seems. There is so much division over it that the only way to get out of this limbo, if you like, is to have a second referendum, to put it back to the people and say, this is where we are at now, what do you want to do?
No, we had a people's vote on the 23rd of June 2016, and the people voted by a majority of over 1 million votes to leave the European Union. We've had a decision. It's now our job as members of Parliament to carry out the instruction that the British people democratically gave us. It is true there are some MPs in Parliament who don't agree.
Even if that means no deal?
Sorry?
Even if that means no deal?
Well, the current legal position is that if we don't agree any kind of deal, and we're certainly, it's plain as a pikestaff, we're not going to agree this withdrawal agreement. That is as dead as a dodo, and members of the Cabinet know that, and so does the whole House of Commons. Then the default position is that we will leave on the 29th of March 2019 under Article 50, under EU law, and under what's called the EU Withdrawal Act, which Parliament passed in the summer, under UK law. So the default is that we will leave. And if we do leave on WTO terms, personally, you know, I'm not frightened by all this sort of Project Fear nonsense. We had all that before the referendum, and that all turned out to be completely untrue. So I'm not saying there wouldn't be any disruption.
Well, I guess people would vehemently disagree with you on that point, whether all of that was untrue.
Well, hang on, let me give you a quick example. We were told in the run-up to the 2016 referendum, George Osborne, who I've always gotten well with, you know, famously said that if the British people voted to leave, 1, the economy would immediately go into recession, 2, unemployment would go up by 500,000, and 3, house prices would fall by 18%. How they got 18 as opposed to 17 or 19, I don't know, but that's what he said. We voted to leave. We voted for self-government. What happened? The economy carried on growing. It didn't go into recession. We now have the lowest unemployment in this country since 1975 and record employment. And house prices have continued to rise, except in some parts of London. And actually some people who live in London might think that's not such a bad thing. So actually, forgive me, but we were threatened with all this. They basically tried to bully the British people not to vote leave. And one thing about the British people, if you look at our history down the centuries, we've never been bullied by anybody, and we're not about to start now.
Mr. Francois, we must leave it there. Thank you very much for your time today, Mark Francois, MP.
Thank you.
Adverts which show a woman being unable to park a car or a man struggling to change a nappy are to be banned from next year. Under a new rule drawn up by regulators, ads mustn't include gender stereotypes which are likely to cause harm or serious offence. This would also include any depiction of girls being less academic than boys. The Committee of Advertising Practice says it wants to call time on stereotypes that hold back people and society. And I can talk now to Dr. Magdalena Zawisza, a senior lecturer in consumer and social psychology at Anglia Ruskin University, whose work was cited in the Advertising Standards Authority report underpinning this ruling. She joins us now via webcam. And thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. Perhaps you could begin by explaining for us what the evidence is about the impact on all of us of adverts that show gender stereotypes.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Yes, I can certainly explain to you. There is quite a significant body of research currently available. We call them exposure research, so advertising exposure research, where in controlled environment, researchers expose participants to advertisements of different content. Now, this research actually shows quite conclusively that exposure to gender stereotypical type of content has various negative effects on women as well as men. Historically, this research mostly focused on the effects on women, and these range from, for example, lowered self-esteem, lowered aspirations, even underperformance on maths, and lower interest in politics and leadership roles after exposure to stereotypical advertisement and their content. For men, on the other hand, we do observe kind of twofold types of effects. On the one hand, men after exposure to such content have been found to have increasingly sexist views on women. But on the other hand, depictions which are very stereotypic about men, so for example, show men in idealized body shapes, these types of depictions lead to lower self-esteem and lower self-efficacy in men themselves.
What sort of impact do you think this is going to have then in real terms on the adverts we see on television or elsewhere?
I'd like to say that this is a really welcome change, and I think Ella Smiley, the lead in ASA, so Advertising Standards Authority, and her team have done a really good job looking at the evidence and proposing these changes. I think this is a very overdue change because we have lots of content analytical studies done over the years, over the last 40, 50 years, which consistently show that actually advertising content keeps lagging behind the changes in society.
Okay.
And we know also from the meta-analysis that these advertisements have generally negative effects on the audiences. So by controlling that content, by giving also very important guidelines to the advertising bodies, advertising companies, we can actually make real change and change how the society views gender.
Dr. Magdalena Zawisza, thank you very much for your time. Very interesting to talk to you. In a moment, we'll have all the business news for you with Mariam, but first a quick look at the headlines on BBC News. EU leaders tell Theresa May she needs to be clearer about what she wants for her Brexit deal and warn her there's no chance of a renegotiation. Police in France shoot dead the gunman who attacked Strasbourg's Christmas market on Tuesday. And unions warn Britain has suffered the worst pay squeeze for centuries, with real pay still a third lower than before the financial crisis.
Hello, I'm Mariam Mashiri. In the business news, travellers at some UK airports are barely being offered $1 for each of their pounds following a month of Brexit uncertainty. Those exchanging pounds at the UK's biggest airport, Heathrow, are finding as little as $1.05 coming back across the counter. And 1 in 7 homes could be paying more than they need for broadband and could get faster services for the same or less money, according to the regulator Ofcom. New research suggests half of UK homes have not taken up faster services, even though they are available. Now, it's been a pretty hectic week, hasn't it, for the UK in terms of the Brexit withdrawal agreement. But what is the impact of all of this on retailers? Well, the clock is ticking, with many warning that the prospect of leaving the EU with no deal is getting ever closer. So what can retailers do to prepare in this short amount of time, or have many of them already prepared for the prospect of a no-deal scenario? Retailers will, of course, depend on frictionless tariff-free trade once Britain leaves the EU. They're now having to put money into contingency plans, eating into already tight budgets after what's already been a pretty tough year. Well, let's talk to Andrew Opie, Director of Food and Sustainability at the British Retail Consortium. Andrew, thanks for joining us. First of all, how worried are retailers who talk to you about the prospect of no deal?
Extremely concerned. It's been one of our main concerns since the referendum, and that's why I've been working with the government and our business members to really help them as much as they can to plan for no deal. But the preference has to be to get a deal, get a transition, an orderly Brexit, so we can adapt our supply chains and make sure we still get the goods we all want on the shelves.
And what does this planning look like? What do these contingency plans look like? We've heard a lot about stockpiling, haven't we?
So three things really. They've looked at their supply chain with their suppliers to see where they might be disrupted, what the border controls, new border controls might mean for them. Secondly, they're looking at their labour to try and give reassurance to their workers from the EU that there is surety to stay here and work. And then thirdly, what the trade issues will be. So we haven't heard much about tariffs yet, which could add costs to imports, but also some really important trade deals that currently the EU has with countries like Turkey, which we need to make sure are ready for us to take advantage of as well.
And of course, consumers are seeing price rises, aren't they, in many aspects of everyday life?
Well, I mean, the thing is, we've seen a slowdown in retail sales over the last 3 months, and the really key thing, we know how tough it is for consumers, so the last thing we need for a really struggling retail industry at the moment is to start spending more money on contingency planning, but also adding uncertainty to consumers, making them think twice about spending in the shops.
OK, Andrew Opie from the British Law Consortium, thank you so much indeed. Very brief look at the markets. I want to show you what's happening. It's not a particularly good day. The London market and the rest of Europe following losses in Asia after some very tough economic news out of China, making investors across the world worry about the prospects for the world